I'm reviewing Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I've written out some notes. Because when I first read the book, I found it a little scattered and bits of it were just a bit bizarre. So when I reread it, I kind of found that I'd overthought it the first time. And the first time I read it, I kind of came away with a feeling that I didn't understand the book. And, there's some things that you read where it's just like it's a little bit too tough of a read, or the author's just being too obscure, and unless you know the background of the author or the subject that they're talking about, you don't really get much from it. But when I reread this and did a little bit of research onto it, it kind of all made sense. So I'm going to go through a plot kind of summary for it, especially if you're being made to read this for study, or you're just kind of like me, and after the first time of reading it, you're like, did I understand it all, and want to go look it up? So the book is probably appropriate for everyone from later high school students, like year 11, year 12 and on. There's two versions of the book, because there is one chapter which contains quite a bit of racist language. The author kind of depicts the racists of his time, and it's pretty obvious that he's doing it to criticize them and to comment on their times. But if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, or if you're young, that's probably not very appropriate. There's not very much like love scene sort of stuff in the book. There is some murder sort of stuff, but again, it's not hugely graphic. It's not like horror or something. So yeah, that's probably who it's appropriate to. If you're super young, this is probably not a book that you'll enjoy, although the little standalone stories in it that the overall novel's built out of, if you just read a select story here and there that someone else has chosen out for you, then you would enjoy this and it would be fine. But trying to put it together as an overall narrative is probably a little tricky if you're younger. So yeah, as I just said, the book is written as a collection of like short stories that switches characters. And the Chronicles part of the Martian Chronicles is it kind of covers a period of history, which is Earth's contact and colonization of Mars. I found that his writing style isn't too hard to read, just every now and then he gets kind of poetic or like surreal, which, considering the book contains people who can mess with thoughts and all of that in the early parts of the book, it can be quite confusing because you don't know when he's speaking in metaphor or when someone's mind's being messed with. Although when rereading it, it's actually pretty clear. I just got confused the first time because, I don't know, I'm not that smart. So, alright, I'm going to go through the basic plot. There's a group of Martian peoples on the planet, and that's where the book starts. And they're telepathic with one another and also with the humans when they come along. The Martians are depicted as being in a state of decay, so they got very advanced technology, but they're depicted as being like kind of, in recession from having been previously greater. And this kind of confused me at first. I didn't really get it, but because a lot of works are based on this, it's not something you haven't seen before. And apparently the guy who wrote Tarzan also writes a lot of sci-fi sort of stuff, which makes sense, right? Tarzan's kind of an adventure sort of book. Edgar Rice Burroughs, I think you pronounce it. And at that time, to say that like all the Martians' riverbeds and that were dried up, as in they were in this state of decay, and he also depicted Martians as being like telepathic with one another and with animals. So while a lot of the themes from this book, the Martian Chronicles, come from the 40s and 50s and from sci-fi at that time, and then that gets blended with their idea at that time of the future, then he puts American like frontier Wild West sort of stuff in with it, because that's kind of what he's contrasting, is the colonization of Mars with the settling of the New World in the United States. He also inserts from the earlier, I suppose it's around 1910, I'm pretty sure Tarzan was written at some time around there, this particular take on what Mars could be like. So that get blended in there, that confused me, and when I researched it, that actually helped make sense, because I'm like, oh, okay, so it's a motif that he's kind of lifted from somewhere else, and he admits it apparently in his own writings and that sort of thing. So initially, the Martians kill off each early expedition of people. So the humans don't seem to know that there's Martians there. And they know something's odd because the expeditions don't come back. The Martians initially find it very easy to trick and get rid of the first, I think, 3 human expeditions, because they're telepathic and they can mess with your mind, and we can't really reciprocate. It's quite interesting. It's not a very coordinated action until the last expedition before the successful one. First is kind of like the wife of this guy, and they're in a kind of bad marriage, sees, like a captain or whatever coming and taking her back to Earth, so he gets jealous, interprets her visions correctly, and shoots the guy. I believe it's the second one, where the humans land, and because everyone's having these visions of humans landing, because the Martians are telepathic and seem to have some type of foresight in dreams and that, they get interpreted as crazy people who think that they're from Earth, and then they get shot, because mental illness is kind of transmittable amongst telepathic people, which is a hilarious premise that I think actually could be explored somewhere else. And the spaceship that they show the guy who's accusing them of just being crazy, he thinks it's a construct because you can influence people's minds. He thinks that he's been influenced to such a degree that he's now singing and feeling the spaceship. So he shoots them and then himself, thinking that it's going to disappear and the problem will end with him. Which I thought was hilarious. That was a really interesting take. On the third one, basically, they coordinate and they mess with and kill off the third expedition. The humans then have a successful expedition, and all of the Martians get sick from contact with the humans. So this is a very easy take now, because it's a kind of a theme that's been played through a couple of different things. But kind of the smallpox blanket to the Native Americans is kind of the idea from that. I don't think there's any intentional nature of the Martians getting sick, but it completely wipes them out, like extinct. So it's not strictly the same as the settlement of the USA and all of that, because obviously not all the Native Americans died. But there is that same type of theme, and it's kind of interesting they chose to get rid of all of the Martians with this, because the next section of the book really asks questions about the morality of settling a place that's already inhabited, and he puts a lot of Western themes and a lot of frontier themes and a lot of like those sort of ideas in it, even just with, not just in terms of ideas, but also in terms of like the physical objects they hold, a kind of oldie time even for the 50s. But it does really change the whole morality of it if amongst your very first little settlements, everyone in that original place dies. Because at that point, you get, it's obviously an accident, and there's no one there anymore. There's no longer any, impediment to settling. I mean, it's bad that it happened, but after it's happened, why not continue to settle? So it's kind of an odd one that he uses that theme, but then also kind of underplays it through that. That's one that kind of confused me. The book then looks at the waves of settlers and why they're going there. And it's interesting, he kind of breaks it into stages, like the very first people might be adventure seekers, and then the next waves are this type of person, the next waves are this type of person, and as it builds and gets more established, different types of people are attracted to the prospect of a new world. I thought that was very interesting. I haven't really seen that idea somewhere else. The other interesting idea is that even though the people are leaving Earth to get away from certain types of problems, like a huge red tape society, a very censored society, not necessarily a very moral society at the time, they bring the problems with them, and even they seem to understand that Mars is going to end up like Earth, because they bring their culture and all their material goods with them. For example, they import huge amounts of pine to build all of their houses. And that's kind of an interesting one. Like they're recreating the exact problem that they're seeking to escape, and I find that I find that one interesting. And if you look at what happened to the United States, I mean, it did end up very similar to Britain, even though a lot of the people that went to the United States were persecuted because of the being religious. I don't know, very religious. I won't say extremists, but they were very, very religious, or at religious odds with the churches and that of the states. So they kind of got the nudge to leave. And then once they leave, they kind of recreate a system very similar to the one that rejected them. So it's an interesting kind of take. This is the chapter that contains all the sort of racist language in it, which could be upsetting for some people. Apparently there is a version of this without it. It did get taken out in the 1997 reprint or something. I personally prefer to read through these things, even if it is a bit messed up, like you're reading Huckleberry Finn or something, just because I find it interesting to see what people at that time actually thought. Rather than read like in a history book and get that guy's take, you read something from a writer at the time, and it reveals things in their own mindset. It's almost like, yeah, you get a glimpse in the underlying thinking through the way that they're able to even tell a story and construct characters. So what happens is all of the African American people in the USA, I'm presuming it's the USA, although there could be African peoples in Europe. We don't have to assume that this is the same Earth that happened, even though every time they reference something from Earth, it seems to be as similar as you can make it, with peoples with 50s technology kind of settling Mars. So all these African American peoples, I think they're one of the earlier waves of people to go. And it's very easy to see their incentive. They're not treated particularly well, and there's a new place. All of the rules don't apply there. If enough of them go, they could be the majority in this place. But there's a kind of weird spin on this, which is the hyper-religious people who were persecuted by the European governments into settling the USA, which kind of then had the problem with slavery. The people that they have then in turn caused a bad deal for by bringing their problems with them from England in some ways. These people are now leaving to go to a new place. So it's interesting if they had if the author had have played out this cycle again, if those people would have then created a problem. For example, there's a particularly racist character, and he's kind of obviously meant to be the bad racism of the times. And he's kind of representative of the worst of that within one character. And he has a young worker who he doesn't want to leave. He tries to call in a debt, like, oh no, you still owe me $50, which I guess in the 50s is a lot of money. And a wealthier black dude comes along and just pays the debt up. And you notice all of the African Americans, they really are helping one another to leave. And also their material goods don't really matter anymore because they're going to make things in a new world. So that's kind of an interesting one. There was one quote from the book that just stuck in my mind, which is, them that has helps them that hasn't. very, very, like, kind of broken English, but that was actually one of the white workers' comment was, he was quite incredulous, like, oh, look, they're just all helping each other, they just want to break ties and get out. And this particularly racist dude didn't even want them to leave. Like, you'd think if he disliked people from Africa and all of that, that he would want them gone. And you kind of see a little bit of, like, the weird relationship, especially at that time, between white America and African America, because the racist dude especially, he mixes he likes getting the cheap labor. He likes the fact that there are poor people to exploit and to boss around, and he gets to be boss. But he also likes the person that he wants to keep. But they can't really be friends because of just how messed up the culture and the situation there is. I mean, if this is written in the 40s and 50s, African Americans can't vote and all of that sort of thing. And so it's not like they could ever actually be friends. It's in another interesting part of this chapter, which is why I thought this chapter was very interesting and I think it's worth reading, is the guy who is particularly racist. You have kind of the scene that you see in a lot of those movies which deal with racism, is all the other white characters are like, come on, man, just let him go. And it's not even like they're depicted as not being racist. They're more just a product of the time. They're not unnecessarily spiteful or nasty. But the particularly racist character, after the other white workers and, like, it seems like middle-class people, shop owners of shops that are, small, or workers at those shops, after they kind of rein him in and say that, like, they're going to step in if he keeps going on the way he is, he kind of turns to picking on his wife, his woman. And he takes as his concession prize the fact that the young man who was working for him called him Mister, even as he kind of tongue-in-cheek, talked a little bit of smack to him as he left. So I thought that was very interesting. He's like, he took as a concession prize a little bit of, like, I don't know, respectful language, would you call it that? It kind of makes him sound superior, I don't know. Like, he took that as a concession prize and then just completely did the displacement thing, moved on to the next person he's going to pick on, which perhaps is telling of nasty people will always take advantage of anyone that the main culture at the time doesn't like. They will always use that to pick on whatever group is disliked. So, if it's no longer okay to pick on people from other, ethnicities, maybe it's okay to pick on people from other cultures or religions. If you can't do that, then maybe it's okay to pick on women. Maybe it's okay to pick on the smaller people who are just physically smaller than you. You see that in high school. So it's interesting. It kind of shows that displacement. As soon as he can't, get his racist way, I suppose, he immediately kind of turns to picking on his wife, which is very telling in a messed up way. After that, it kind of cuts back to Mars. I'm obviously skipping through here. I don't want this video to be even as long as it's going to be. It cuts to a Fahrenheit, like, 451 type scene. I hope I got the number right. Sometimes I mess that up hilariously. Where the government has banned everything, not even just inflammatory or anything, but imaginative or speculative at all. They've, like, banned every book that entertains, like, a flight of fancy, tries to just invoke an emotion, tries to, like, just teach a moral lesson, I suppose. They don't really delve into that side of it, but I suppose even like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, or, Aesop's Fables, the Sour Grapes, all of those sort of lessons, the tortoise and the hare, the ones that are meant to have a little point, and you're meant to learn something from it. I suppose they've even banned those. This chapter involves the most, like, graphic sort of murder stuff. There is a character who kills off a bunch of other people. And it's kind of like Edgar Allan Poe-esque, which is ironic because he gets referenced in the chapter, in the fact that, like, thought-wise, it's kind of messed up, but it's not actually very graphic. It's not like it's not like a Saw type of murder. It's more like a Hitchcock sort of murder, where it's the idea of it that's upsetting. And just reading through my notes here. It's interesting, though, that this guy who does all of this just cannot stand that the government has gotten rid of basically all of the fiction section of a library. His own library that he had on Earth got destroyed. He's building this, like, house where everything's uncomfortable. He's built it to invoke displeasure, an unsettling, dissonant feeling in anyone who goes into it. And he kind of is, you can kind of get the idea that he's exploring what things creep us out, what things spook us, as well as just grabbing old fables and mishmashing them through there. So he's really trying to excite even some of the negative parts of the imagination. And it's kind of in this chapter that I feel like the author implies that this culture on Earth, which is very censored and very based on just like materialism, realism, those sort of things. They only care about things that are completely concrete. It kind of aids their very toxic culture because they don't seem to be very advanced morally or ethically. And I think the author is like sneakily conflating those two things. He's saying they've rejected all the stories. They did bring religion with them, interestingly. They brought their Earth religions to Mars. So they don't seem to be non-religious, which is kind of at odds with that now that I think of it. But they don't seem to be very ethically advanced. It seems like the technology's gotten away from the development of ethics. One's advanced quicker than the other, which is a theme that we've seen a lot in other books, but they're probably copied from this and from things that this has copied. So if you're reading this to enjoy it, not because you're studying it or like you read it, got a little confused like I did, kind of wanted to see if you'd figured all of the book out, then you might want to click away now and then read through it and get the ending yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to go in and go through the ending. So the ending kind of arc of stories gets triggered when you hear about a war on Earth. Everyone on Mars hasn't been on Mars long enough to really call it home. Which, now that I think of it, is a little bit like the First World War in a way. You know, Americans had their own national identity and everything, but when Europe went to war, they turned around and went to war, even though it really didn't involve them. In one sense of the thing, like their borders weren't at risk. England's were. And so some of that lingering old identity got cashed in and they end up going to war as well. So you see that idea played out here. They start all going back to Earth to participate in this atomic war. With very, very few exceptions. It's really only people who didn't hear about it or rocked up too late or to go on a ship who didn't go, which seems to only be like not even a classroom full of people. I don't even think it's as many as like 10, 20 people, although perhaps the author just doesn't go into some people who are lost on a mountain somewhere. This is where some of the more interesting stuff in the book happens, which is why I was kind of recommending anyone who wants to read it themselves click off, because the author starts to go into very interesting ideas here, and you can kind of see how sci-fi as a genre has developed from little things that this book just touches on. So there's some very forward-thinking scenes with robot intelligence and automation, as the very tiny number of humans who are not interconnected anymore with one another at all, they use robots to replace their social needs. I'm pretty sure there's 2 different examples of that. The book leaves open as to whether or not these robots are sentient, but it seems like even for the technological times, these robots are particularly excellent. And it seems like the robotics side of things seems just on the cusp of taking off, because even in the censorship section, it's actually robots that do all the murder and all of that, but they look very much like whatever they're meant to be depicting, and they can seem to be able to fool anyone into thinking that they are what they appear to be. So if there's a robot that's meant to be look like me, you would actually mistake it for me, unless you were told or subjected it to some kind of test. But at an eye test and a speaking to a test, it would probably pass. The robots don't seem to be completely sentient because they do copy a bunch of pre-scripted behaviors. So, for example, after one of the humans dies, there's only the robot kind of family left over, and they light a fire to keep themselves warm, which kind of makes it sound they're more running off a script. But when there's a ship captain who lands and witnesses the guy's death and speaks to the family afterwards, from speaking to them, he kind of feels like they're alive, and he goes in there, one of them goes in there to shoot the family, like to, kind of do away with them, and they offer him a cup of tea, and then he can't do it because that's such a human thing. It's very interesting. So I feel like some of the forward-thinking sections in this book is like lost civilization kind of arcs in general. Questions about colonization and colonialism and that sort of thing, I think have been copied from works like this so many times that they don't seem particularly interesting when you read this. Even though chronologically this happened first, I mean, I only read this because I think it was the Star Trek captain's interview or something, and they were asked about their favorite sci-fi works, and this was one of them, so that's why I read this. And I'm glad I did, but because so many people have based what they did on it, certain parts of it have been copied so many times, it's not interesting, but I find it interesting some of the ends that weren't really explored. The book basically ends with some of the people who fled Earth. Doesn't really seem like any of the people who left from Mars to Earth and are coming back actually made it. Some of the people who left Earth and arrived on Mars, and the first guy to arrive to get in from that fleet, I suppose you say, of people coming, implies that there's a whole bunch more coming, but he doesn't know how many. They kind of leave it open as to whether or not there's even enough humans to reproduce the human race without, the amount of inbreeding that you can't get off the ground, which is a problem they have with endangered animals and all that. They come to Mars, but he also specifically burns all of these laws and academic papers and all of these things that he sees as being the reason that things went badly the way they did. And he very strongly says, like, he's not bringing anything from the Earth culture. He wants to start again, and he hopes it goes better this time. It's very interesting. So the things I found a little odd was the fact that everyone from Mars went to Earth. I think that's more for the convenience of playing out the ideas that the author wanted to do. I don't think... I mean, perhaps... I mean, he was closer to the First and Second World Wars than I was. Perhaps it really did feel like that. Like, you're in a village of 1,000 people, and the war comes round, and, 100 of the women go to do, I don't know, nursing or whatever it was that they were actually allowed to do at that time. And, so, I don't know, 200-300 of the able-bodied men just disappear. And then even just from that, a lot of those people leave the rural areas to go contribute in the manufacturing and the farming for the war efforts. Actually, there probably would be towns that were completely desolate and unpopulated and maybe even never got repopulated because of these great wars. But I just don't feel like everyone would go from Mars to Earth, even if he's trying to recreate the feeling of that when it felt like it happened. So, all right, so that's about half an hour of me sitting here talking, so I'm going to wrap it up there.
The men who wrote them, from Moses to the tribunal of Alpha 3, books.